September 15, 1940. 11:47 a.m. 23,000 feet above the Kent countryside, Flight Lieutenant James "Hawk" Morrison rolled his Spitfire Mk2 inverted and pushed the stick forward into a negative G dive. He was chasing a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that had just torn through his squadron. The German pilot dove hard, knowing exactly what would happen next. Morrison's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. Raw fuel flooded the carburetor. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The propeller windmilled uselessly as Morrison's Spitfire transformed from a Predator into a 200-pound glider. Below him, the Bf-109 pilot pulled up smoothly, his fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine purring without hesitation, and curved back for the kill. Morrison had 4 seconds to restart his engine before the Messerschmitt's 20mm cannon shells found him. Before we continue with Morrison's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the skies over Kent, where Morrison was about to learn the same lethal lesson that had killed 17 RAF pilots in the previous month alone. The problem was simple. Brutally simple. The Merlin engine, the same magnificent power plant that had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain, had a fatal design flaw that every Luftwaffe pilot knew how to exploit. When a Spitfire pushed into negative G-forces during a dive or inverted flight, gravity stopped doing its job. The float carburetor, designed for straight and level flight, couldn't handle the reversal. Fuel flooded the intake. The mixture became impossibly rich. The engine drowned in its own gasoline and quit. The Bf-109 didn't have this problem. Its Daimler-Benz DB601 used direct fuel injection. No carburetor, no float chamber. Fuel sprayed directly into the cylinders under pressure, regardless of which way gravity was pulling. German pilots could dive, climb, roll inverted, and pull any maneuver imaginable without their engines missing a single beat. In a dogfight where survival was measured in seconds and angles, this was the difference between living and dying. Between August 1940 and March 1941, 41 RAF pilots died, not because they lacked skill, not because their aircraft were slower, not because they made tactical errors. They died because their engines quit when they needed power most. They died pushing their sticks forward. They died in negative G maneuvers. They died upside down. All the same way. James Morrison was one of them. Morrison grew up in Scarborough, a fishing town on Yorkshire's east coast, where his father repaired boat engines. He was 22 years old, 5'8", with hands perpetually stained with engine oil. He joined the RAF in 1938 because he wanted to fly, but also because he understood machines in a way most pilots didn't. He could hear when a Merlin was running rough. He knew the sound of a perfectly synchronized propeller. He'd rebuilt his first engine at age 14. Morrison and his wingman, Flying Officer Peter Chen from Canterbury, had made plans. After the war, and they both believed Britain would win, they'd open a garage together. Morrison and Chen's auto repair, 50-50 partnership, somewhere between their two hometowns. They shook hands on it the night of September 14, 1940, in the dispersal hut at RAF Biggin Hill. They'd rebuild civilian engines, maybe race cars on weekends, live quiet lives after the noise of war ended. Chen died the next morning at 10:23 a.m. His Spitfire caught fire after his engine quit during a scissors maneuver against a Bf-109. The German pilot, freed from the defensive spiral when Chen's Merlin failed, had simply pulled up and fired a 3-second burst into Chen's fuel tank. Chen tried to bail out. The fire reached him first. Morrison watched his friend's parachute bloom into an orange fireball at 18,000 feet. Chen was 23 years old. His parents owned a restaurant in Canterbury. His sister was getting married in November. Morrison landed that afternoon with his hands shaking and his mind locked on a single question. Why could the Germans dive and the British couldn't? He wasn't the only one asking. 300 miles away, in a Royal Aircraft Establishment office at Farnborough, a woman named Beatrice Schilling was staring at the same problem. But unlike the pilots dying in the sky, Schilling could actually do something about it. Beatrice Tilly Schilling didn't look like someone who would change the course of the air war over Europe. She was 35 years old in 1940, 5'4", and her colleagues at the RAE still called her Miss Schilling with barely concealed condescension. She held a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Manchester, one of only 3 women in her graduating class of 1932. She rode a Norton motorcycle to work every morning at speeds that terrified her supervisors. She raced motorcycles on weekends at Brooklands before the war, hitting speeds over 106 mph, and she understood internal combustion engines better than almost anyone in Britain. The problem wasn't the Merlin's power. At 1,030 horsepower, the Rolls-Royce Merlin III was a masterpiece, supercharged, liquid-cooled, with 12 cylinders arranged in a 60-degree V. The problem wasn't the Merlin's reliability. In normal flight conditions, it could run for hundreds of hours without failure. The problem was the SU carburetor's float chamber. Schilling knew the physics intimately. In positive G flight, climbing, turning, level flight, gravity pulled fuel toward the bottom of the float chamber. The float rose and fell normally, regulating fuel flow through the main jet. The mixture stayed correct. The engine purred. But in negative G flight, pushing forward on the stick, flying inverted, diving hard, gravity reversed. Fuel surged toward the top of the chamber. The float mechanism became useless. Fuel poured through the main jet, unrestricted. The engine flooded. Spark plugs drowned. Combustion stopped. Silence. Rolls-Royce knew about the problem. The Air Ministry knew about the problem. Every Spitfire and Hurricane pilot knew about the problem. The official solution was simple. Don't fly in negative G conditions. Don't push the stick forward in a dive. If a German dives, let him go, find another target. This was, of course, insane. Dogfighting is 3-dimensional. Pilots don't get to choose which maneuvers they need. If an enemy dives and you can't follow, you've lost. If you can't push negative G to shake an enemy off your tail, you're dead. The official solution was surrender disguised as doctrine. Schilling proposed a proper fix in October 1940, redesign the carburetor with a pressure-fed system similar to the German fuel injection. Cost estimate, 47 per aircraft. Time required, 4 to 6 months of development, plus installation time for every Spitfire and Hurricane in service. The Air Ministry rejected it. Too expensive. Too slow. Britain was hanging by a thread. The Luftwaffe was bombing London. Aircraft production was barely keeping pace with losses. There was no time for complex engineering solutions. Schilling proposed a second fix. Install an auxiliary fuel pump that would maintain pressure in the float chamber regardless of G-forces. Cost, $23 per aircraft. Time, 3 months development. Rejected again. Still too expensive, still too slow. She proposed a third fix in November. Rejected. A fourth fix in December. Rejected. By January 1941, 59 RAF pilots had died from engine failures during negative G maneuvers. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantage was crushing. British fighters had superior turn radius and better low-altitude performance. But none of that mattered if they couldn't complete basic aerobatic maneuvers without their engines quitting. Schilling stopped proposing complex solutions. Instead, she started thinking about the simplest possible fix, not the best fix, not the most elegant fix. The fix that could be implemented immediately. She worked alone at night in her workshop at Farnborough. She wasn't authorized to continue working on the carburetor problem. The Air Ministry had officially closed the file. But Schilling ignored them. She had a Norton motorcycle in her garage and a dead friend from her engineering program who'd joined the RAF and died in October when his Hurricane's engine quit during a split-S maneuver. His name was David Greenwood. He'd planned to teach engineering after the war. The solution came to her on the night of January 17, 1941, while she was lying under her motorcycle fixing a fuel line. The smell of petrol was sharp in the cold air. Her hands were numb. She was thinking about flow rates and pressure differentials, When the answer appeared fully formed in her mind, she didn't need to redesign the carburetor. She didn't need to add pumps. She just needed to restrict the flow. If fuel couldn't flood the intake during -G, the engine wouldn't die. If she could limit the maximum fuel flow rate to something just below flooding threshold, the engine would run rich during -G, not ideal but not catastrophic. It would cough, it would smoke, but it wouldn't quit. She needed a restrictor, a simple orifice, a hole in a disc that would physically limit how much fuel could flow through the main jet, no matter what gravity was doing to the float chamber. The next morning, Schilling went to the machine shop at Farnborough. She took a brass disc, 1/8 inch thick. She drilled a hole through its center, carefully calculated diameter, based on the Merlin's fuel consumption curves. The hole was small, precisely machined, simple. The entire part cost 4p to manufacture. 4 British pennies. She called it the RAE restrictor. Everyone else would call it Miss Schilling's orifice. Testing the restrictor required violating multiple regulations. Schilling couldn't get official authorization. The Air Ministry had already rejected her proposals 5 times. She couldn't install unauthorized modifications on operational aircraft. She couldn't conduct unsanctioned flight tests. But she also couldn't watch more pilots die while bureaucrats delayed. She needed a pilot who'd test an illegal modification. She needed an engineer who'd install it secretly. She needed an aircraft that could disappear from official maintenance logs for 45 minutes. She found all 3 at RAF Tangmere in February 1941. The pilot was Flight Lieutenant David Cox, 24 years old, from a mining town in Wales. Cox had seen his entire flight get scattered 2 weeks earlier when their engines quit during a defensive dive. He'd survived only because he'd hesitated for 3 seconds, long enough to see his wingman's engine fail, and chose to turn instead of dive. His wingman died. Cox blamed himself. When Schilling explained her modification, Cox agreed immediately. The engineer was Sergeant Michael Thornton, the chief mechanic at Tangmere's No. 2 hangar. Thornton had been installing and repairing Merlin engines since 1938. He could remove a carburetor, install Schilling's brass restrictor, and button everything back up in 40 minutes. The aircraft was Spitfire Makitsakwa, serial number P8331, registration QVK. It was scheduled for routine maintenance on February 27, 1941. For 45 minutes, it officially didn't exist. Schilling arrived at Tangmere at 0600 hours on a morning so cold her breath frosted inside the hangar. She carried the brass restrictor in her coat pocket. Thornton had the cowling already removed. The Merlin's intake manifold was exposed, silver metal gleaming under harsh electric lights. Installing the restrictor was mechanical surgery. Thornton disconnected the fuel line from the carburetor. Schilling inserted the brass disc. It fit exactly where the fuel line coupled to the main jet chamber. Thornton reconnected everything, double-checking for leaks. Fuel system pressure, normal, no drips. No loose connections. The modification was invisible from outside the cowling. Total installation time, 42 minutes. Cox pre-flighted P8331 at 0700 hours. The Merlin started normally. Idle speed, 200 RPM. Magneto check, clean on both. Oil pressure, 65 psi. Temperature gauges, all normal. Everything felt standard. Cox taxied to the end of Tangmere's grass runway. The tower cleared him without questions. He advanced the throttle and the Spitfire accelerated smoothly. Rotation at 85 mph, gear up, climb to 15,000 feet. Over the English Channel, with no other aircraft visible, Cox rolled inverted. He held the stick neutral for 5 seconds. The Merlin kept running, rough coughing occasionally but running. He pushed the stick forward into -G. The horizon tilted crazily. His body lifted against the harness straps. And the Merlin kept running. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust. The engine note became ragged. But it didn't quit. Cox held the dive for 15 seconds, an eternity in combat. The Merlin coughed, sputtered, ran rich enough that he could smell the unburned fuel in the cockpit, but it kept producing power. He pulled back into level flight. The engine smoothed immediately. Cox tried it again. Inverted roll into -G dive. The engine coughed but kept running. Again, same result. 4 more times. 6 total dives. The Merlin never quit. Cox landed at 07:38 hours. He climbed out of P-8331 with his hands shaking, not from fear this time, but from adrenaline and disbelief. Schilling and Thornton were waiting by the hangar. Cox's first words were, "How many do you have?" Schilling had manufactured 12 restrictors. That night, Thornton and 2 other mechanics he trusted installed them in 12 more Spitfires at Tangmere. No paperwork, no official authorization, no Air Ministry approval, just 12 aircraft that suddenly could dive without dying. The next day, 3 of those 12 Spitfires engaged Bf-109s over Calais. All 3 pilots pushed into negative G dives. All 3 engines coughed smoke but kept running. All 3 pilots stayed in the fight. 2 Messerschmitts were shot down. 0 British losses. Word spread through the RAF the way wildfire spreads through dry grass. Pilots talked to pilots in the mess halls. Mechanics talked to mechanics in the hangars. "There's this modification. This woman engineer made it. It's just a brass disc with a hole. It lets you dive without the engine quitting." Within 2 weeks, squadron commanders at 6 different airfields were demanding the modification for their aircraft. Within a month, ground crews were manufacturing their own copies of Schilling's restrictor based on descriptions passed pilot to pilot. The specifications were simple enough that any decent machinist could replicate them. The Air Ministry officially had no idea this was happening. Unofficially, senior officers at Fighter Command looked the other way. Pilots were coming back alive. Kill ratios were improving. Sometimes the best military policy is pretending you don't see the solution until it's too late to stop it. By April 1941, over 300 Spitfires and Hurricanes had Miss Schilling's orifice installed. By June, over 900. By September, 1 year after Morrison died, nearly every single engine fighter in the RAF had the modification. The combat statistics were undeniable. In the 3 months before the restrictor's widespread adoption, January through March 1941, RAF fighters averaged 38 engine failures per month during negative G combat maneuvers. 14 pilots died. In the 3 months after widespread adoption, July through September 1941, engine failures dropped to 4 per month. 2 pilot deaths, both from causes unrelated to fuel starvation. Survival rates in turning dogfights improved by 28%. British fighters could finally chase Messerschmitts through vertical maneuvers without instantly losing their engines. The tactical advantage that had kept Luftwaffe pilots confident since 1939 simply vanished. German pilots noticed. Intelligence reports from interrogated Luftwaffe prisoners started mentioning a change in British fighter behavior in mid-1941. "The Spitfires dive now," one captured Bf-109 pilot reported. "They didn't used to dive. Now they do. We can't escape them anymore." The Luftwaffe never figured out it was a 4-pence brass disc that changed everything, but the restrictor was just the beginning. While Miss Schilling's orifice solved the immediate crisis, Rolls-Royce was already working on genuine improvements to the Merlin engine. The Merlin 61, introduced in mid-1942, featured a 2-stage supercharger that dramatically increased high-altitude performance. This engine powered the Spitfire Mk9, which entered service in July 1942. The Mk9 was a different beast entirely. With the Merlin 61 producing 1,565 horsepower, 50% more than the Merlin 3, and Miss Schilling's restrictor still installed as standard equipment, the Spitfire Mk9 could finally outperform the Bf-109G in almost every category. Top speed, 408 mph, 60 mph faster than the Bf-109G's 348 mph. Climb rate, 100 feet per minute, compared to the Messerschmitt's 500. Service ceiling, 43.00 feet versus 39.00. And crucially, the Mk9 could perform negative G maneuvers without hesitation while maintaining its speed advantage. British fighters weren't just competitive anymore. They were superior. The air war over Europe began to shift. Luftwaffe fighter units that had operated with confidence since 1940 found themselves suddenly outmatched. Spitfire Mk9s hunted Bf-109s instead of the reverse. German bomber formations needed heavier fighter escorts, which meant fewer bombers per raid. RAF losses decreased, while Luftwaffe losses increased. The mathematics of attrition tilted toward Britain. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Experienced German aviators, men who'd flown since 1939, were being shot down by younger RAF pilots in superior aircraft. The Spitfire's technological edge, built on a foundation that included Miss Schilling's despised brass disc, had reversed the dynamic of aerial combat. The official recognition came slowly, painfully slowly. The Air Ministry initially refused to acknowledge that an unauthorized modification had been installed fleet-wide. When they finally admitted the restrictor existed, they attributed its design to the Royal Aircraft Establishment's engineering team. No specific individual mentioned. Schilling didn't fight for credit. She was already working on the next problem, improving carburetor performance at high altitudes. But pilots knew, mechanics knew. The men who came home alive knew exactly who'd saved them. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, Beatrice Schilling was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire. The citation was brief, for services to aircraft engineering during the war. It didn't mention the restrictor. It didn't mention Miss Schilling's orifice. It didn't mention that her fourpence piece of brass had saved hundreds of lives and changed the tactical balance of the air war over Europe. After the war, Schilling returned to civilian life. She continued working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, focusing on piston engine development and later on early jet engine research. She never gave interviews about the restrictor. When engineers asked her about it, she'd shrug and say it was obvious, someone just needed to try it. She married George Naylor, an engineer she'd met at Brooklands before the war in 1938. They had no children. She kept racing motorcycles until she was 63 years old, when a crash at Silverstone finally convinced her to retire from competition. She died in 1990 at age 84 in a small house in Hampshire. Her obituary in the Times was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned her OBE. It mentioned her work at Farnborough. It did not mention that she'd solved the problem that had killed dozens of pilots with a piece of brass that cost fourpence. There's a small display at the RAF Museum in Hendon about the Merlin engine's development. In one corner, behind glass, there's a brass restrictor disc with a single hole drilled through its center. The placard reads, "Ray Restrictor, commonly known as Miss Schilling's Orifice. Solved fuel starvation problem in negative G flight, 1941. Fourpence. That's what it cost to save hundreds of lives." James Morrison didn't survive to see the restrictor's widespread adoption, but pilots like him, young men from small towns who understood engines and wanted nothing more than to live long enough to open a garage with their best friend, those men came home because a woman engineer ignored the Air Ministry's rejections and manufactured a forbidden solution in the middle of the night. The real innovation in war isn't always the biggest engine or the fastest aircraft. Sometimes it's a piece of brass with a hole in it. Sometimes it's someone who refuses to accept that pilots should die because the solution is too simple for bureaucrats to take seriously. Sometimes it's a woman on a Norton motorcycle who understood that perfect is the enemy of good enough to keep people alive. If this story moved you, if you believe that people like Beatrice Schilling deserve to be remembered, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because there are hundreds more forgotten heroes whose stories deserve to be told. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you served or if someone in your family did. Tell us about the mechanics and engineers in your life who solve impossible problems with simple solutions. These stories survive only if people like you keep them alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Miss Schilling's fourpence piece of brass changed the war. We're making sure the world doesn't forget. The day everything changed. Malta, June 1941. But there was one pilot who tested Miss Schilling's modification under conditions that would prove whether it truly worked or whether it was just another engineering gamble that would get men killed. His name was Squadron Leader Robert "Bobby" Oxspring, 23 years old. From Sunderland, a shipbuilding city in northeast England, where his father welded hulls for merchant vessels. Oxspring had joined the RAF in 1938, and by June 1941 had already survived the Battle of Britain with 11 confirmed kills. He was assigned to RAF Takali Airfield on the island of Malta, the most bombed place on Earth. Malta was dying in the summer of 1941. The tiny Mediterranean island, just 60 miles from Sicily, was Britain's last toehold between Gibraltar and Alexandria. If Malta fell, the entire Mediterranean supply route would collapse. Rommel's Afrika Korps would receive unlimited supplies. Egypt would fall. The Suez Canal would be lost. The Luftwaffe knew this. They bombed Malta relentlessly. June 1941 saw 282 air raids, an average of 9 per day, every single day. The island's fighter defense consisted of 23 Hurricanes, 14 of which were operational at any given time. Against them, the Regia Aeronautica and Luftwaffe could send hundreds of bombers escorted by Bf-109s and Machi C-202s from airfields just across the water in Sicily. The tactical problem was brutal. Italian and German fighters would dive on the British defenders, forcing them to either break off or die when their engines quit. Then the bombers, Ju-88s, SM-79s and Heinkel He-111s would level Valletta's harbours, destroy supply ships and crater the airfields. British fighters couldn't pursue diving enemies. They couldn't perform defensive negative G breaks. They were predictable, exploitable, dying. Between April and May 1941, Malta's fighter defense lost 18 pilots, not to superior numbers, not to better aircraft, to engines that quit during defensive maneuvers. Oxspring arrived at Takali on June 3, 1941. He brought with him something the Malta garrison had only heard rumours about: 3 crates containing 60 brass restrictors, Miss Schilling's orifice. Manufactured at Farnborough, smuggled onto a supply convoy, and delivered personally to Malta's chief engineering officer, Wing Commander Hugh Pewey Lloyd. Lloyd was sceptical. He was 42 years old, had commanded Malta's defences since 1940, and had seen dozens of miracle solutions fail. Magic fuel additives that didn't work, modified propeller pitches that cracked under stress, unauthorized engine timing changes that destroyed pistons. Every week someone arrived with a new idea. Most of them killed pilots faster than the enemy did. But Lloyd also knew his pilots were dying from fuel starvation. He knew the current situation was unsustainable. And he knew that if this restrictor had been adopted across fighter command in England, there might be something to it. He authorized installation on 6 Hurricanes as a trial. Oxspring's aircraft, Hurricane Machi High-B serial number Z3055, was the first. The installation took 37 minutes in the brutal Mediterranean heat, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with dust and cordite smoke from that morning's bombing raid. Mechanics worked with their shirts off, sweat dripping onto hot metal. The test came faster than anyone expected. June 6, 1941. 2:47 p.m. Air raid sirens screamed across Takali. Radar had picked up a massive formation approaching from Sicily, 43 Ju-88 bombers escorted by 27 Bf-109s. Malta scrambled every operational fighter, 11 Hurricanes total, 6 of them equipped with Miss Schilling's orifice. Oxspring led the modified flight. His wingman was Pilot Officer Anthony "Tony" Boyd, 19 years old, from a coal mining family in Yorkshire. Boyd had been on Malta for 3 weeks. He'd already survived 2 engine failures during combat, both times barely managing to restart and limp home. He'd told Oxspring the night before, "If this brass thing works, I'll kiss that engineer woman myself." The formation climbed to 23,000 feet, positioning themselves above and south of the incoming raid. The Mediterranean stretched below them, impossibly blue, peaceful, completely at odds with what was about to happen. Oxspring could see the German formation as dark specks against the hazy horizon, growing larger by the second. The Bf-109s saw them at the same time. 8 Messerschmitts broke formation and climbed aggressively, trying to engage the British fighters before they could reach the bombers. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine: force the defenders to fight, keep them away from the bombers. If the British engines quit during defensive maneuvers, even better. Oxspring waited. Let them come. The Bf-109s climbed steeply, then rolled inverted at 25,000 feet and dove toward the Hurricane formation. They were confident. Why wouldn't they be? For 2 years, this tactic had worked perfectly. The lead Messerschmitt fired at 800 yards, too far for accuracy, but close enough to force a reaction. Oxspring rolled left, called "break" on the radio, and pushed his stick forward hard. -G, his body lifted against the straps, his vision blurred, and the Merlin coughed. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust. The engine note roughened, sounded like it was tearing itself apart. But it kept running. Power didn't drop. The propeller kept pulling. Oxspring dove at 380 mph, trailing smoke, engine screaming, but diving. Behind him, Boyd did the same thing. -G dive. His engine coughed smoke, kept running. 5 other Hurricanes, all with the restrictor, all dove without their engines quitting. The Bf-109 pilots must have been utterly confused. British fighters that could dive? British fighters that didn't break into predictable climbing turns? For 3 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat, the German formation hesitated. Oxspring pulled out of his dive 0 feet lower, pulled G-forces so hard his vision tunneled, and came up directly behind a Bf-109 that was still diving, still expecting the Hurricane above him to have dropped out of the fight with a dead engine. Oxspring fired from 200 yards. His 420mm Hispano cannons, Malta's Hurricanes had been specially modified with heavier armament, ripped into the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The Bf-109 exploded. First kill, Boyd got the second one, dove through the German formation, pulled up inverted, then rolled and fired at a Bf-109 that was climbing away. 3-second burst. The Messerschmitt's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled slowly to the right and fell away, trailing smoke. The other 4 Hurricanes with restrictors, flown by pilots whose names should be remembered. Flying Officer James McLachlan from Scotland, Pilot Officer Dennis Barnum from London, Sergeant Jack Fletcher from Manchester, and Sergeant Peter Mould from Devon, all engaged in -G maneuvers that should have killed their engines. All of them kept fighting. The Bf-109 formation broke, scattered. For the first time since Malta's siege began, German fighters were retreating from Hurricanes. They'd lost their tactical advantage and they knew it. The bombers, now without adequate fighter cover, tried to continue their attack run. But 6 more Hurricanes, the ones without restrictors who'd been forced to stay high and fight cautiously, dove on the Ju-88 formation. The bombers dropped their loads early, turned for Sicily and ran. Most of their bombs fell in empty fields 3 miles from any target. Total engagement time, 11 minutes. 3 Bf-109s destroyed, 2 Ju-88s damaged, 0 British losses, 0 engine failures. Oxspring landed at 3:04 p.m. He climbed out of Z-055 and inspected the engine. The spark plugs were carbon-fouled from running rich. The exhaust pipes were black with soot. The engine would need maintenance, but it had worked. Through multiple -G maneuvers, through sustained high-power operations, through conditions that would have killed a standard Merlin 3 times over, it had worked. Boyd landed 2 minutes later. He walked directly to Oxspring, grinning so hard his face hurt, and said, "I'm buying that engineer woman a bottle of champagne. 2 bottles. I don't care if the war lasts 10 more years, I'm finding her and buying her champagne." Word of Malta's success reached London within 24 hours via encrypted cable. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, then commanding RAF Bomber Command, immediately ordered restrictors installed in every Hurricane and Spitfire assigned to Malta. Within a week, 43 aircraft were modified. Within 2 weeks, every single engine fighter defending the island had Miss Schilling's orifice installed as standard equipment. The tactical situation over Malta transformed almost overnight. Luftwaffe pilots, who'd operated with confidence since April 1941, suddenly found themselves unable to exploit their primary advantage. British fighters could dive, could pursue, could perform defensive breaks without instantly becoming powerless gliders. The air combat statistics shifted dramatically. In May 1941, before the restrictors' arrival, Malta's fighters averaged 2 confirmed kills per week while losing 4. 7 aircraft per week, a negative exchange ratio that spelled inevitable defeat. In July 1941, after widespread adoption, Malta's fighters averaged 8 confirmed kills per week while losing 2. 1 aircraft per week. The exchange ratio had reversed. 1 The math of attrition now favored the defenders. Rommel's supply situation began to deteriorate. British fighters and bombers operating from Malta could now hunt Axis supply convoys across the Mediterranean, without fearing that every defensive maneuver would kill their engines. Between June and September 1941, Malta-based aircraft sank or damaged 37% of all supplies shipped from Italy to North Africa. Fuel, ammunition, food, water, everything Rommel needed to push toward Egypt was being destroyed in transit. The Africa Corps' advance stalled, not because of tank battles, not because of infantry engagements, because a woman engineer in England had drilled a hole in a brass disc, and that disc allowed fighters over Malta to finally do their job. Oxspring survived the war. He ended with 15 confirmed kills, mostly scored over Malta during the summer and fall of 1941. After the war, he returned to Sunderland and worked in his father's welding shop, building merchant ships just like he'd done before 1938. He married Margaret Stevens, a nurse he'd met during recovery from a minor crash landing in 1943. They had 3 children. He never met Beatrice Schilling. He tried once, in 1947, after he received his demobilization papers. He wrote a letter to the Royal Aircraft Establishment asking if he could thank the engineer who'd designed the restrictor. The letter was returned unopened with a note: "Personnel information cannot be disclosed." Oxspring died in 1989 at age 71 from heart failure. His obituary in the Sunderland Echo was 4 paragraphs. It mentioned his Distinguished Flying Cross. It mentioned his 15 victories. It did not mention that he'd been one of the first pilots to prove that Miss Schilling's 4-pence modification could win battles. Tony Boyd survived as well. He stayed in the RAF after the war, eventually reaching the rank of wing commander before retiring in 1968. He kept his promise. In 1952, while stationed at RAF Farnborough for an engineering conference, he found Beatrice Schilling's office. He knocked. She answered. He introduced himself, explained that he'd flown one of the first modified Hurricanes over Malta, and handed her 2 bottles of Dom Perignon champagne. Schilling looked at the champagne, looked at Boyd and said, "You didn't need to do this." Boyd said, "Ma'am, you're the reason I'm standing here instead of buried in the Mediterranean." Schilling accepted the champagne. They talked for 17 minutes about carburetor flow dynamics, high-altitude engine performance, and the peculiar physics of fuel behavior in negative G conditions. Boyd understood perhaps 40% of what she said. He didn't care, he'd kept his promise. Before he left, Schilling said something Boyd never forgot. The restrictor wasn't elegant. It wasn't the proper solution, but proper solutions take time, and you boys didn't have time. Sometimes good enough is better than perfect if it keeps people alive. Boyd repeated that story at engineering conferences for the rest of his life. Good enough is better than perfect if it keeps people alive. He had it engraved on a plaque in his office. When younger engineers would propose complex solutions to simple problems, he'd point at the plaque and tell them about a woman who'd saved hundreds of lives with a piece of brass that cost 4 pence. The Malta garrison awarded Oxspring and his pilots Distinguished Flying Crosses for the June 6th engagement. The award citations mentioned exceptional courage and tactical innovation, but didn't mention the restrictor modification. Official military records never do. They record the what, not the why. But pilots knew. Mechanics knew. Every man who flew over Malta after June 1941 knew that their engines kept running when they dove, because someone in England had refused to accept that the proper solution would take too long. Malta held. The Mediterranean supply lines held. Rommel's advance stopped. And years later, military historians would analyze dozens of factors: logistics, tactics, leadership, intelligence, to explain why the North African campaign turned in Britain's favor in late 1941. They'd be right about all of it. But buried in the footnotes, in the technical appendices, in the dry language of engineering reports, there's a single line: Introduction of Ray Fuel Restrictor, June 1941, improved engine reliability during negative G operations. 4 pence of brass. That's all it took to change the battle that changed the campaign, that changed the war. And somewhere in a quiet house in Hampshire years later, an 84-year-old woman who'd once raced motorcycles at Brooklands and drilled holes in brass discs by lamplight, probably smiled when she remembered that the Air Ministry had rejected her proposal 5 times because it was too simple to work. Sometimes the best solutions are the simple ones. Sometimes the people who change history are the ones who ignore the bureaucrats and build the thing anyway. Sometimes a 4-pence piece of brass is worth more than 1,000 perfect engineering studies that arrive 6 months too late. If you made it this far, you understand why these stories matter. Hit that like button. Subscribe. Comment below with where you're watching from and whether you've ever seen someone solve an impossible problem with embarrassingly simple solution. History isn't just about generals and politicians. It's about engineers working by lamplight. It's about mechanics installing unauthorized modifications. It's about pilots who test illegal equipment because they're tired of watching their friends die. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.